Hello and welcome to another episode of Reading Together from Sea Harp Press. I'm Eugene Luning, co-founder of Sea Harp, and I'm excited to continue our journey today through C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. In our last episode, we finished his book 2 within this work. Today we're going to be going into book 3, and the title of this book is Christian Behavior. Obviously, since we're beginning, we'll be in chapter 1. And the title of that chapter is The Three Parts of Morality. There is a story about a schoolboy who was asked what he thought God was like. He replied that, as far as he could make out, God was the sort of person who was always snooping around to see if anyone is enjoying himself and then trying to stop it. And I am afraid that is the sort of idea that the word morality raises in a good many people's minds. Something that interferes, something that stops you having a good time. In reality, moral rules are directions for running the human machine. Every moral rule is there to prevent a breakdown, or a strain, or a friction in the running of that machine. That is why these rules at first seem to be constantly interfering with our natural inclinations. When you are being taught how to use any machine, the instructor keeps on saying, no, don't do it like that. Because, of course, there are all sorts of things that look all right and seem to you the natural way of treating the machine, but do not really work. I like the simplicity of that last little analogy he gives us. When you're learning how to use, let's say, some sort of a saw, the person teaching you is going to say, not quite like that. And I think when we think of God as being like the great policeman, as J.B. Phillips calls him in the book, Your God is Too Small, we tend to think of him as this sort of killer of fun. But I'd really like that picture there of somebody who's teaching you the use of a particular machine, not because we need to have like a mechanistic understanding of God, but because sometimes we're not quite doing it right. Our natural proclivities, our inclinations, our gut, well, not always the wisest way to be going. So I like that. That's simple, and I can remember that the rest of the day. I'll keep reading. Some people prefer to talk about moral ideals rather than moral rules, and about moral idealism rather than moral obedience. Now, it is, of course, quite true that moral perfection is an ideal in the sense that we cannot achieve it. In that sense, every kind of perfection is, for us humans, an ideal. We cannot succeed in being perfect car drivers or perfect tennis players or in drawing perfectly straight lines. But there is another sense in which it is very misleading to call moral perfection an ideal. When a man says that a certain woman or house or ship or garden is his ideal, he does not mean, unless he is rather a fool, that everyone else ought to have the same ideal. In such matters, we are entitled to have different tastes and therefore different ideals. But it is dangerous to describe a man who tries very hard to keep the moral law as a man of high ideals, because this might lead you to think that moral perfection was a private taste of his own, and that the rest of us were not called on to share it. This would be a disastrous mistake. Perfect behavior may be as unattainable as perfect gear changing when we drive, but it is a necessary ideal prescribed for all men by the very nature of the human machine, just as perfect gear changing is an ideal prescribed for all drivers by the very nature of cars. And it would be even more dangerous to think of oneself as a person of high ideals, because one is trying to tell no lies at all, instead of only a few lies, or never to commit adultery, instead of committing it only seldom, or not to be a bully, instead of being only a moderate bully. It might lead you to become a prig, and to think you were rather a special person who deserved to be congratulated on his idealism. In reality, you might just as well expect to be congratulated because, whenever you do a sum, you try to get it quite right. To be sure, perfect arithmetic is an ideal. You will certainly make some mistakes in some calculations. But there is nothing very fine about trying to be quite accurate at each step in each sum. It would be idiotic not to try, for every mistake is going to cause you trouble later on. In the same way, every moral failure is going to cause trouble, probably to others and certainly to yourselves. By talking about rules and obedience instead of ideals and idealism, we help to remind ourselves of these facts. Now, what I like that Lewis is doing with this idea of moral perfection, not perfectibility, but perfection, like moving toward this rule, by not setting out and saying, well, I'll do this some of the time, but actually saying, well, these are sort of the rules of the machine. This is how it properly works. What I love that he's doing, and I know where he's going, is this is kind of what I might describe as a Romans 7 perspective on morality. He's setting us up for the absolute impossibility of doing this perfectly on our own. And yet, that does not negate the fact that there is, in fact, like we described in the first book, natural law, way of right and wrong. And even if you are somebody who's a real relativist in the ethical and moral sense, well, think about it this way. If people treat you without any sort of moral standard, how do you feel? I know sometimes we like to transgress the boundaries for ourselves when it gets us ahead or feeling a certain pleasure, but if other people do that to us, we are very quick to insist upon our rights. So, ethically, morally, there are rights and wrongs. The truth of the matter, though, is that we are not, in our flesh, really able to pursue this rule perfectly. And there is the problem. I'll keep reading, but I think you know where this is all going to end and with whom this is all going to end. Now, let us go a step further. There are two ways in which the human machine goes wrong. One is when human individuals drift apart from one another, or else collide with one another and do one another damage by cheating or bullying. The other is when things go wrong inside the individual, when the different parts of him, his different faculties and desires and so on, either drift apart or interfere with one another. You can get the idea plain if you think of us as a fleet of ships sailing in formation. The voyage will be a success only, in the first place, if the ships do not collide and get in one another's way, and secondly, if each ship is seaworthy and has her engines in good order. As a matter of fact, you cannot have either of these two things without the other. If the ships keep on having collisions, they will not remain seaworthy very long. On the other hand, if their steering gears are out of order, they will not be able to avoid collisions. Or, if you like, think of humanity as a band playing a tune. To get a good result, you need two things. Each player's individual instrument must be in tune, and also each must come in at the right moment so as to combine with all the others. Now I love, just as I said earlier, I love Lewis's analogies, and I love these two, but I particularly like the second one, the idea of a band or a symphony playing together. If they are not actually playing according to the notes on the page and the ways that they harmonize with each other, well, it's going to sound like a cacophony. Also, if they don't pay attention to the conductor's cues, they're going to be out of time with one another. It reminds me, right over here on my shelf, is The Pursuit of God by A.W. Tozer. Perhaps you watched some of that series with me. I love still, one of my favorite moments in that entire book is when he talks about the argument that perhaps in the modern day we're being too individualistic about following Jesus in the body. Well, he says, have you not realized that 100 pianos all tuned to the same fork are by necessity tuned to one another? So here with these ships that are in and out of alignment, or with their engines or their rudders not working properly, and especially I love with that band or orchestra. Friends, when we are attuned in each single day of our life to the Spirit of Jesus, well then if I ran into you on the street, we would have great unity between us, even union, because we would be about the same head of the same body. So let's never forget as we read, as we watch Lewis unpack these glorious arguments, that it all ends with Jesus. It's his way. It's not even a Christian way. It's his way. It's the way that he is leading us all the time. All right, I'll keep reading. But there is one thing we have not yet taken into account. We have not asked where the fleet is trying to get to, or what piece of music the band is trying to play. The instruments might be all in tune and might all come in at the right moment, but even so, the performance would not be a success if they had been engaged to provide dance music and actually played nothing but dead marches. And however well the fleet sailed, its voyage would be a failure if it were meant to reach New York and actually arrived at Calcutta. Morality, then, seems to be concerned with three things. Firstly, with fair play and harmony between individuals. Secondly, with what might be called tidying up or harmonizing the things inside each individual. Thirdly, with the general purpose of human life as a whole. What man was made for, what course the whole fleet ought to be on, what tune the conductor of the band wants it to play. You may have noticed that modern people are nearly always thinking about the first thing and forgetting the other two. When people say in the newspapers that we are striving for Christian moral standards, they usually mean that we are striving for kindness and fair play between nations and classes and individuals. That is, they are thinking only of the first thing. When a man says about something he wants to do, it can't be wrong because it doesn't do anyone else any harm. He is thinking only of the first thing. He is thinking it does not matter what his ship is like inside, provided that he does not run into the next ship. And it is quite natural, when we start thinking about morality, to begin with the first thing, with social relations. For one thing, the results of bad morality in that sphere are so obvious and press on us every day. War and poverty and graft and lies and shoddy work. And also, as long as you stick to the first thing, there is very little disagreement about morality. Almost all people at all times have agreed in theory that human beings ought to be honest and kind and helpful to one another. But though it is natural to begin with all that, if our thinking about morality stops there, we might just as well not have thought at all. Unless we go on to the second thing, the tidying up inside each human being, we are only deceiving ourselves. And I want to just pause there, because this is a fascinating little turn Lewis is about to make. When we only think about morality as it pertains to the collective, to all people everywhere, Lewis's point is there's a certain utilitarian argument to that. Well, as long as it doesn't get in the way of others, either causing frictions or pushing them off in the wrong direction, well, then it simply doesn't matter at all. But we know pretty well, as followers of Jesus, especially if we've read the Sermon on the Mount, that there's something more in play here. Jesus himself seems to point to the Old Covenant and to its collectivized understandings of ethical and moral behavior when he says the famous, "You've heard that it was said." He's pointing back to a law that was for essentially a nation and eventually a nation state. But then what does Jesus say? "But I say to you." And what does he do with every "but I say to you"? He takes us into the inner life. One of my good friends philosophically, he's right there, is Epictetus, and I've referenced him before. I love Epictetus as one of the Stoics because he always takes it back to the inner life, to this sort of citadel of this inner place that we really actually possess life, live life, ponder, experience emotion, but also courage. The reason I'm interested in that particular Stoic is because he describes the inner life so beautifully that I can begin to see that it is in fact the place where Jesus has come, conquered, and who wants to reign there over my inner life. So as Lewis is about to pivot into that second and third part of moral rule, well, I just want to remind you that your inward self, that is actually the place that Jesus has shed his blood for. Yes, it will have ramifications out there in the world with everyone else if you have peace with God within. But that's where things have to begin. We have to possess what's ours. Okay, I'm going to keep reading. What is the good of telling the ships how to steer so as to avoid collisions if, in fact, they are such crazy old tubs that they cannot be steered at all? What is the good of drawing up on paper rules for social behavior if we know that, in fact, our greed, cowardice, ill temper, and self-conceit are going to prevent us from keeping them? I do not mean for a moment that we ought not to think and think hard about improvements in our social and economic system. What I do mean is that all that thinking will be mere moonshine unless we realize that nothing but the courage and unselfishness of individuals is ever going to make any system work properly. It is easy enough to remove the particular kinds of graft or bullying that go on under the present system. But as long as men are twisters or bullies, they will find some new way of carrying on the old game under the new system. You cannot make men good by law. And without good men, you cannot have a good society. That is why we must go on to think of the second thing, of morality inside the individual. But I do not think we can stop there either. We are now getting to the point at which different beliefs about the universe lead to different behavior. And it would seem, at first sight, very sensible to stop before we got there and just carry on with those parts of morality that all sensible people agree about. But can we? Remember that religion involves a series of statements about facts, which must either be true or false. If they are true, one set of conclusions will follow about the right sailing of the human fleet. If they are false, quite a different set. For example, let us go back to the man who says that a thing cannot be wrong unless it hurts some other human being. He quite understands that he must not damage the other ships in the convoy, but he honestly thinks that what he does to his own ship is simply his own business. But does it not make a great difference whether his ship is his own property or not? Does it not make a great difference whether I am, so to speak, the landlord of my own mind and body, or only a tenant responsible to the real landlord? If somebody else made me for his own purposes, then I shall have a lot of duties which I should not have if I simply belonged to myself. Now, this is an interesting moment. And again, yet another Lewis turn. As he looks at this idea between the first and the second of his moral kind of understandings he's unpacking, and says that the first essentially presupposes the importance of the second. But that second has a presupposition in it that we cannot think of our inner life as being simply for ourselves. In fact, this human body that's mine, is it for my own pleasure, my own advance? Or am I actually the belonging of someone else? You and I think we need to remember from time to time that knowing Jesus and having been bought by his blood, we are in fact plunder. We are the spoils of war. We've been bought back, and at what a price, as Paul tells us. We've been bought to actually be the possession of Jesus so that we might go out into the world and grab hold of those lost ones who are still yet to be his. It elevates the purpose of our days and also elevates the importance of, again, that inner life I was just talking about. Friends, how are you taking journeys in that space? How are you using, let's say, you take the dog out for a walk. How are you using that 15 minutes? Is it just to walk around looking around? Or is it to actually continually commune with the one whose possession you are? All right, I'm going to finish out the chapter. Again, Christianity asserts that every individual human being is going to live forever. And this must be either true or false. Now, there are a good many things which would not be worth bothering about if I were going to live only 70 years, but which I had better bother about very seriously if I'm going to live forever. Perhaps my bad temper or my jealousy are gradually getting worse, so gradually that the increase in 70 years will not be very noticeable. But it might be absolute hell in 1,000,000 years. In fact, if Christianity is true, hell is the precisely correct technical term for what it would be. And immortality makes this other difference, which, by the by, has a connection with the difference between totalitarianism and democracy. If individuals live only 70 years, then a state or a nation or a civilization which may last for 1,000 years is more important than an individual. But if Christianity is true, then the individual is not only more important, but incomparably more important. For he is everlasting, and the life of a state or a civilization compared with his is only a moment. It seems then that if we are to think about morality, we must think of all three departments: relations between man and man, things inside each man, and relations between man and the power that made him. We can all cooperate in the first one. Disagreements begin with the second and become more serious with the third. It is dealing with the third that the main differences between Christian and non-Christian morality come out. For the rest of this book, I am going to assume the Christian point of view and look at the whole picture as it will be if Christianity is true. I've referenced this before, not in this series, but in another, that one of the other great moments in all of Lewis's writings comes from The Weight of Glory, when he talks about the fact, just like he does here, that in fact individuals are immortal. That could be for good or for ill, but that as we go about, like, let me paint a picture for you. Let's say this evening you're on your way home from work and you just remembered that one thing at the grocery store, and you have to rush in and you're tired and you have dinner waiting to be made at home, and it's been a long day filled with emails and deadlines and all of these things, and you're feeling so crunched, and you run into that store forgetting that every single person in the aisles and that person checking you out at the end of your purchases, all of these people are immortal beings, some of whom have yet to know their eternal Father. Then, friends, that trip into the grocery store may be, in fact, the most important thing you did all day today. Because as you go in, yourself an immortal one destined for glory, as you carry the full weight of the kingdom within you, then you are showing people that each of these individuals is far more important than some idea like a nation or a civilization. This is why, friends, and I don't want to get too political here, but this is why we should not align ourselves politically in such a way that we forget the importance of the individuals who make up any collective. If our patriotisms, if our politics gets in the way of loving every single person with whom we're confronted, then those things have to go. We cannot allow anything to step in front of our understanding of our burden we carry for the sake of the glory of Jesus and his love. So friends, I greet you as one immortal being to another. And I remind you that nothing you will do today has any importance except for the way that you hearken to and follow the way of Jesus. What a joy that he has called us to be immortals in his service. And what a glorious thought that someday when we're face to face with him again, we may hear those words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Well, the building blocks of that statement, of course, it's all tied up in him, but also it has to do with today. So let's live it. Let's be wonderful bearers of this standard as we go throughout whatever day you're living today. Thanks for joining me. We have been in C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. This is a HarperCollins hardcover edition of the book. And just to remind you, we have been in Book 3, Chapter 1. I look forward to our next episode, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.